We're talking about St. Phillips tonight, and we are so happy to have many people from St. Phillips here tonight with us. So, brothers and sisters, we're glad you're here. We want to thank the Salem Creek Regional Conference of Churches, which is co-sponsoring this event tonight, and we want to thank Trinity Moravian for hosting our event. The order of our program is this: we will hear from Dr. Sensbach, and then there'll be a little more time for audience questions. We do ask that when you have a question that you use the microphone that will be provided for questions so that our folks watching on Facebook can hear. Dr. Jon Sensbach teaches early American history at the University of Florida. He teaches a graduate course on early America and has taught a graduate seminar on Black Atlantic as well as undergraduate courses on the Atlantic slave trade, colonial America, and the American Revolution. Dr. Sensbach is the author of Rebecca's Revival, Creating Black Christianity in the Atlantic World, and A Separate Canaan, The Making of an Afro-Moravian World in North Carolina, 1763 to 1840. These books are on sale at our book table over on the side of our building tonight. And I think he has agreed that he'll sign your book if you want him to, so he'll be available for...
You have to buy it first.
He did say you had to buy it first, that's correct. From 1989 to 1982, Jon served as coordinator for the African Americans in Salem program at Old Salem Incorporated. He spoke earlier today at a luncheon commemorating the Juneteenth celebration. We're grateful that Jon is joining us tonight to talk about St. Phillips Moravian Church, which is one of the oldest African American congregations in the nation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jon Sensbach.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come speak here at this occasion in connection with your speaker series. And it's a pleasure for me to come back to Winston-Salem. As Carol mentioned, I lived here for 3 years. I was doing my research at the Moravian Archives, and so it's a pleasure to see familiar faces here and make some new friends as well. I have now deep family roots to go back into this community, so I have a tremendous emotional and intellectual wellspring of attachment that goes deep here. And so what I would like to do tonight is to talk about St. Phillips. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. St. Phillips is a marvelous institution, and it deserves a careful consideration about what it is, how it came to be, and its meaning for this community, and as a symbolic marker of the history of race in this country. It can stand to serve as some broader lessons that extend beyond our community. Thanks. Okay. How is that? Good. Okay. St. Phillips, I would propose that St. Phillips stands at the middle of an American paradox, which is that on the one hand, the history of Christianity, including the Moravian Church, is or attempts to be a history of inclusion. By extension, the American democratic experience is or attempts to be an experience of inclusion. The history of race in America has largely been an experience of exclusion. And St. Phillips exists at the juncture of that tension. It exists right in the middle of it. It emerges from the heart of that tension, and it can tell us a lot about that enduring tension that we all live with today. We begin by observing that tomorrow, June 17th, is a sorrowful anniversary, a one-year anniversary, 1 year ago today, or tomorrow, that the Charleston church shootings happened. And we all know about that. A madman, a racist goes into an African-American congregation and simply blows people away, committing this defilement in the heart of a sacrosanct space. Now, in the aftermath of that, of course, the horror, the shock, what does it mean? How can somebody do that? As a historian, I was eagerly reading the accounts, as we all were, about this to try to find out what it was all about. Of course, you can approach this from many different angles, but as a historian, I couldn't help but notice that, that in the initial reporting, that there were invariably stories, a couple of paragraphs, like, what is this church, this Emmanuel AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston? And, the reporters did what digging they could, and they learned that this was a historic African-American church, and it had deep roots in the African-American community in Charleston, and that it after the Civil War, it revived and went on and was a pillar of the community in Charleston. And then, of course, the national conversation turned elsewhere, and talking about the Confederate flag and gun control and things like that. And so the discussion quickly moved into more contemporary matters. But as a historian, I was still stuck on the fact that for a very brief moment, the nation had to confront the fact that here was this historic institution, and how did it come to be? For me, that was important because it resonated closely with my experience of the St. Phillips story. The St. Phillips story emerged almost exactly contemporaneously with the emergence of the AME Church, the Emmanuel AME Church, and it emerged from the very same kinds of motivations and aspirations on the part of congregants and of white parishioners, both in Charleston and here in what was then the Salem community. So with this AME Church then, Emmanuel, we learned then that this was a powerful expression of African-American religious sensibility, that in the Methodist Episcopal Church in the early 19th century in Charleston, that there was largely a black congregation, but of course it was controlled by white parishioners. And the black congregation was mostly enslaved, but there were quite a few free people of color as well. Tensions arose in Charleston, as throughout the rest of the new nation, about biracial worship. It was seen as a threat. It was seen as bringing the races too closely together. And so in Charleston, therefore, African-American congregants segregated themselves out. They were also driven out by white prejudice, and they formed this separate congregation, Emmanuel. In the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion in Charleston in 1822, this church was targeted as a scene of the rebellion, that the congregants were seen, that this was seen as a kind of a staging point for the rebellion, that Denmark-Vesey and his comrades in rebellion used the church as a kind of pretext or an organizing space in which to plot out the rebellion, which of course was foiled and betrayed before it ever happened. Okay, so this was 1822. The congregation that came to be called St. Phillips eventually in the 20th century was founded in this community in 1822, exactly the same year as Denmark-Vesey's rebellion. And so the history then of this congregation here, of the St. Philip's congregation, mirrors very closely things going on in the rest of the country. Now let's take a look and see what those things are. How did St. Philip's come to be? How did this early congregation come to be? And how did it function as a space of worship? How did it function as a space of spiritual expression within a slave society here in this Moravian community? Well, let's talk about some deep history that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but to refresh our memory, we know that the Moravians were deeply involved in mission activity in the West Indies as early as the 1730s. They weren't the very first missionaries to preach to enslaved people of African descent in the Americas. The Quakers and others did it before, but we could say that the Moravians were probably the most successful on an early basis. Their eagerness to reach out to enslaved African communities in the West Indies, in St. Thomas, St. Croix, Jamaica, Antigua, and elsewhere, mark them as pretty unusual in the 18th century. The zeal with which they reached out, the sense of extending this promise of spiritual equality to enslaved people who had been denied this, was a powerful message, and it was a powerful message to be preaching it in the middle of a slave situation, slave society. So as we know, the missionaries were often roughed up, beaten by the planters, and they were often treated as pariahs. Nonetheless, they persevered, and they made hundreds and then thousands of converts and established African congregations, many of which still exist. They are the oldest, essentially African Protestant congregations in the world. They're all Moravian. New Herrenhout, New Carmel, other churches in the West Indies. This is the early legacy of the Moravian experience. So a deep commitment to mission work, a deep sense of trying to reconcile this promise of Christian equality to people who had been regarded simply as non-humans, as pieces of chattel, as enslaved people unworthy to receive this message. So by the time the Moravians come here, then they've settled in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They have their first experience there of slave holding in Bethlehem, where the Moravians owned slaves, as they did in the West Indies as well. And by the time they come to Salem, the first Bethabara, of course, then Bethania, then Salem, in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s, they had this legacy of slave holding among themselves. They don't see any biblical contradiction to own and buy and sell human beings, but they do try to reconcile it in the spirit of the gospel, which in their interpretation means to extend the gospel to enslaved people and to try to treat them with as much Christian compassion as they could. It didn't always work out, because we know that the Moravians bought and sold human beings as well. But this was the contradiction that they struggled with, and in their mind, it was not a contradiction at all. So that is the first thing to deal with, is that when we try to understand the story, that the early Moravians did not see a contradiction between slavery and Christianity. Of course, we would now all agree that there is a contradiction, but on their terms, they did not see that contradiction. So in the early years, then, many of you know the story, which is that many of these enslaved people were baptized and inducted into the Moravian community and accepted as spiritual equals in this fellowship of brothers and sisters. They worshiped with white Moravians, sat on the same church benches, shared many degrees of daily intimacy with them. There were black men living in the single brother's house. There was at least one young black woman living in the single sister's house. And this is 1770s, 1780s. There were black farm managers of Moravian farms, black industrial managers working in industries like the pottery and the tannery and other kinds of things. So the African-American contribution to the economic and social life of the community was profound. It was deep. It was large. The numbers of people that we're talking about were relatively small. We're not talking about major plantations on the southern style, 300 slaves on a plantation. No, it wasn't anything like that. But this was a relatively small-scale situation where this community, this interracial community of white and black brothers and sisters, tried to make a life together. We think, for example, of people, some of the very first people who came here were directly from Africa. People like Christian, who was bought in the 1780s. His life story, his so-called memoir, is in the Moravian archives, and it's accessible and it's readable. And it tells the story of how this African person came to be enslaved and brought to America and incorporated into this community. His wife, Anna, similarly an African-born Moravian. These would have been people who survived the horrible experience of the slave ship, the Middle Passage, the horrible disruption of being captured and sold as a slave in Africa, brought to America. This was part of their mental baggage. This is part of who they were. For many of them, trying to build a new life out of the shreds of their former life meant trading whatever kinds of spiritual commitments they would have had in Africa, belonging to secret religious societies. One enslaved African named Abraham, for example, there's a good chance that he was Muslim because he came from a part of West Africa, Senegambia, that was heavily Islamicized by the 18th century. And so these people had a variety of different understandings of religion, and they came to America, and here they are in the middle of this Moravian community where they speak German, and what kind of strange language is that? So they have to build a new life. And for many of them, building a new life meant coming to an understanding that the Moravian community offered some sense of acceptance, of respect, of fellowship, of humanity that being enslaved did not. And so, building from that understanding, we see in the records clear documentation of how they went through the process of going to class with the Moravians, learning about the religion of the Moravians, learning to speak English or German, learning some of the basics of the faith, and then going through this process of applying to the lot, that old 18th century custom that the Moravians did of putting the yes or no lot, and whether you could actually be baptized. So they do that. All of that is very clearly documented in the Moravian records. And so as a result, then we know that by 1790, 1800, there was a small but growing core of people of African descent, both born in Africa and born here in America, who were members of the Moravian community. This tension then between their physical enslavement and their spiritual equality was what they lived with every day. In some cases, the spiritual equality won out in the sense that they were treated as brother Abraham or sister Anna, and treated with a kind of sense that you are a brother and sister in Christ, you are part of our fellowship, you are part of us. On the other hand, they weren't free. They were still enslaved. They still had to go work in the tannery as an enslaved person, no matter the degree of respect or authority that they might have had. And so this was their tension that they lived with. Now, in the late 18th and early 19th century, this tension worked its way out, not only in the Salem community or the Moravian community, but also nationwide. Here was this new nation. The American Revolution was over. And here was this decision that had to be made across American society in general. Here's this country founded on principles of equality, inalienable rights, all the rest of that stuff. And yet slavery is thriving. There is some question of slavery, sure. Some Virginia slaveholders like George Mason, George Washington, and others emancipated their slaves, and they're to be congratulated on that score. But for the rest of the nation, the question was, well, what is the future of slavery in this country? And that was answered in the Constitutional Convention when slavery was pretty much guaranteed in the form of the Three-Fifths Compromise. So here was this tension between a nominally free society, a republic, that still had slavery at its core. In religious terms, this tension was felt very strongly in these evangelical communities that were beginning to spread throughout the country. If you are a Christian and you are accepted into this church fellowship, then presumably it is because you are regarded as an equal in the eyes of Christ. And yet, all over the country, white Christians were becoming very, very uncomfortable and threatened by the presence of black worshipers in their midst. There's the famous story, of course, of Richard Allen in the Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in the 1780s, where he knelt down to pray. He was a free man of color. He knelt down to pray, and some of the white brethren in the church yanked him up by his lapels and kicked him out of the church and said, "We don't want you here." So he withdrew, and with fellow African-American parishioners founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This was then the origin of the church that, of course, the Charleston Emmanuel congregation was a part of. But we see this going on throughout the country. We see this going on in Philadelphia. We see it in the north. We see it in the south. We see it in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Newport, Rhode Island. We see it in Richmond, Virginia, Savannah. Up and down the Atlantic seaboard, the same kind of thing where white Christians are increasingly threatened by black participation within their congregational life because the inherent promise of spiritual equality is there. Okay, if I'm accepted in your congregation, I may be slave, I may be free. If I'm African American, that means that I'm your equal, right? Doesn't it mean that? And white parishioners had to think about that. And increasingly the answer was, well, no, actually you're not. Sorry to tell you, but no, you're not our equal. And to force that line of inequality, congregations, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican, or Episcopal, began writing in their journals. Boards of elders began passing new laws within their congregation saying, no, we are going to enforce strict racial segregation lines. The same thing happened here in the Moravian Church. I'll read you some examples of some of the things that happened so we can get a sense for how this played out. Here's one example I'm reading from my book. That's part of this research I did years ago, where in the Friedberg community to the south of here, in 1797, we see the case of an African-American girl who had wanted to join the Moravian Church, and the records tell us that she had studied, she attended Bible classes, she wanted to do this. This was part of who she wanted to be. And it said she had asked permission to join the congregation of the older girls' choir in Friedberg. And so when it says that the day that she showed up, a group of girls and parents had persuaded these people not to tolerate any Negro in these meetings. And so when Brother Schneider wished to hold the last meeting, they all walked out. It is now known for certain that the situation is to be blamed not only on the girls, but especially on some of the mothers. And so this shocked the Board of Elders. This shocked them that they could, there's insubordination on the part of the white congregants. And the elders reprimanded them, saying that not the slightest distinction between whites and blacks can be made in matters of the spirit. Not the slightest distinction can be made. So this is 1797. Already you see signs of racial separatism, or at least a desire for separatism on the part of white congregants. And at that point, the Board of Elders makes a stern response saying, no, we can't do that. That's not who we are. Remember our history. Remember the fact that we were missionaries. We set the bar high for accepting people of African descent into our congregations. We can't do that. And yet, the ball seemed to be rolling. A few years later, there was an episode where the Board of Elders wishes to know the opinion of the committee whether the reception of Negroes in the congregation by a kiss of peace, as is customary, was anyway disagreeable to be performed in a meeting of the society. It has been always done so here as in other congregations, but at times, as times and circumstances have changed, scruples have started lately. Now this is a really telling episode. The kiss of peace, one of the important sacraments, one of the important rituals in the ancient Christian church, and has always been part of the early Moravian church as well. So when early African Americans were accepted into the Moravian church, it was with the kiss of peace, which is to say that the white minister would kiss any new entrant into the church on the cheek. Okay, and so it didn't matter who you were, black or white, slave or free. Now, in 1810, they're saying, can't do it anymore. Sorry, we can't do it, because scruples have been started lately. A similar episode reports that with the sacrament of the foot washing, the pedilavium, which is an important part of Moravian ritual as well, that in accordance with, as Jesus washed the disciples' feet, that so too Moravians would wash each other's feet. And so black and white Moravians would wash each other's feet as well. This was the symbolic washing away of sin, the symbolic acceptance of all into this community of the Spirit. And in something like 1812, the Moravians pass a new rule that say, no, we're not going to have white people washing black people's feet anymore. It's just not going to happen. So you read these things and you can see the change unfolding with particular clarity. And we now can see that there's a kind of tragic element to it. At the time, white Moravians believed that they were responding to changes in their society. There were demographic changes among their own community. The German settlers, many of them were passing on. Their children who were born in America increasingly were acculturating themselves to the way of life in the South, which is, again, this driven on firmer demarcation lines of racial separatism. And so in that regard, you can see all these changes unfolding in the history of this community. By 1815, African Americans who had always been buried in Salem God's Acre, not only in Salem, but also in Bethabara, in Hope, in Freeburg, and elsewhere, you can see African American graves there, still as a kind of a demarcation point on the landscape. They've left its permanent mark on the landscape, buried among and alongside white brothers and sisters in the Spirit. In 1815, the Board of Elders says, no, not going to do it anymore. So at that point, separate African American graveyards were established. Finally, then, in 1822, the Female Mission Society was founded in Salem, a group of young women who, with every good intention, said, look, why don't we just form a separate African American congregation to remove this contradiction, remove this inconsistency, remove African American worshipers from our very midst. We should also say that this impetus came from the white sisters, the Female Mission Society, but we could also speculate that it came from African American worshipers as well, who were clearly distressed and uncomfortable with the segregation, the discriminatory acts that had been passed against them, and were probably quite willing to separate themselves and get away from all the discrimination into a place of their own making, their own worship. So this then is the origin of the Negro congregation, as it was called in the 1820s, and again, the origins of what now is called St. Phillips Church. Now, the founding of this church is an interesting thing. So it's founded by and controlled by white Moravians. Abraham Steiner is the first pastor there. He is a white pastor who has had long experience in the mission field, and so he's regarded as an experienced hand. So he is the pastor of this community, of this new community of the faithful. And these people then, the early congregants, they would have had this experience of being, worshiping with interracial communities of Moravians. Now they are in a whole separate congregation. So many of them had this memory with them. Some of them, in fact, include some of the very first African members of the community, people like Anna, who was an old woman by that point, other African-born members, as well as members of the interracial community of brothers and sisters from the years past. So in the early years then, the history of this community, of this new congregation, is a history of struggle for control of the religious life and spiritual life of the congregation. As I mentioned before, with the case of Emmanuel AME in Charleston, okay, so in the aftermath of the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion, the congregation was shut down. The congregation was seen as this place of suspicion and rebellion and resistance, and we can't have that. We're going to shut it down. Similarly, in the 1820s and 1830s, the lifeblood of the new Negro congregation revolved around the efforts of congregants themselves to control their own religious life in the face of the fact that they were largely enslaved and that their pastor was white, and he was seen not only as a minister for their religious needs, but also as a proxy for the maintenance of slave control within the community. This reflected the sense among white Moravians as among white Southerners generally that African American religion was a source of resistance, a source of potential rebellion, and a source of suspicion that had to be controlled. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. In the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion, for example, in 1831 in Virginia, rumors spread like wildfire into this community. They spread throughout the South. My God, Nat Turner was leading, this is just the tip of an iceberg. He was leading this massive rebellion that's going to sweep throughout the South and spread through all our communities, so we have to be incredibly vigilant to try to suppress it. So we have a record then of how that played out in this community here. There was a report that reached Bethania, for example, that 200 Negroes had assembled in the neighborhood of Lexington, were murdering the people there, and by evening would reach Salem. So here's this wild rumor. Of course, it wasn't true, and yet it is fed by the fires of Nat Turner's rebellion, and immediately suspicion gets cast upon the Negro congregation. And so a regulation was passed that enslaved people throughout Wachovia were forbidden upon pain of death to leave their lots. And after services at the Negro congregation, some of the Negroes were stopped by the patrol and were alarmed. So the reports were false, of course. There was no mass murder of people here in North Carolina. And so eventually the patrols were eased up. But you can see how the existence of the church itself, the fact that here you had congregants 30, 40, 80, 100, 150 people at a time meeting in the log church, the first structure built by the Moravians in 1823, that this is a source of fear, of potential rebellion, of resistance, and so therefore had to be controlled. There's another case in 1835 where there was suspicion of another rebellion in Mississippi, and this spread the flames of suspicion through the Upper South as well. And then there's a report that in the aftermath of this rebellion, a large group of people, Africans and African Americans, celebrating the anniversary of the Caribbean missions, were celebrating at the African American Church. And a huge crowd of people came out to celebrate this. And this was exactly at the time when reports of this slave rebellion were rippling throughout the South. Today, there was a largely attended meeting in Salem for Negroes. The rumor reached the Negroes that anyone could attend the love feast by paying 6.5 cents. They came from 20 miles around Salem. It is the opinion of our people that it is at this time inadvisable for the Negroes to use such a pretext for gathering in such a mass. They were too proud to go on foot, and so they hired horses and wagons from all quarters. So we can imagine this startling scene. Here's people coming from 20 miles around, walking, hiring horses, wagons. This is a big event in this community, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the mission in the West Indies. So there clearly is a symbolic importance for the worshipers themselves that they want to honor this. They want to celebrate this long history of African American participation in the Moravian Church, and they are aware that this goes back 100 years. So what do? They come in there, and immediately the report goes out, we can't have that happening. So we've got to put out the slave patrols, we have to call this off, make sure this doesn't happen. So the point here, therefore, is that the black church itself is a fulcrum for debate about African American spirituality and its relationship to the slave society from which it emerges. On a daily basis, you see this struggle being played out, where enslaved congregants themselves want to go preach, even if only on an informal basis, to others, or they want to organize a love feast, or they want to take control of some aspect of the church life. They are constantly being reprimanded by Abraham Steiner and by other white ministers saying, no, you can't do that, or if you do, you have to make sure you get our permission, otherwise you're not going to be able to. So this is again a proxy for the larger debate about slavery and its relationship to the church and to this community. In 1861, on the cusp of the Civil War, this is the time when the new brick church, log church, is abandoned, and the congregational life shifts over to the brick church, and it's a magnificent. Of course, it was restored some years ago. It's a beautiful place. It's now part of the interpretation of Old Salem, and it's a magnificent space. But that masks some of the deeper history, the underlying symbolic history of this congregation and its role in this community. In 1861, obviously, the Civil War is about to break out. I think it's not a coincidence that the church is built at that point as a means of kind of ensuring the loyalty of the enslaved population. Here we have this, we've done this wonderful thing for you, we've built this magnificent new church, and a great place to worship, and should this Civil War ever impinge on our neighborhood, we're pretty sure you know whose side you're going to be on, right? So this was, I think, part of the quid pro quo. The legacy, of course, is that it resulted in this magnificent church. After the Civil War was over, it remained a powerful gathering space for the congregation. It remained a point of transition from slavery to freedom, from the period before emancipation to a post-emancipation period. Of course, there's that famous episode where in April of 1865, the Union cavalry officer gets up and reads an announcement in which he says to the assembled congregation, lest there be any doubt about your status, the war is over and you are now free. So it's a powerful moment that happens in that space, and it's a powerful moment for this community. Of course, the question of what happens afterwards is strong and it's powerful. What's next? What does freedom mean? Who gets to be free? What's the limits of freedom? What's the extent? And we know that these questions were being raised and asked all over the South at this point. And the answers, of course, nobody really knew the answers. There was no blueprint for this. We see the struggle for control among newly elected Southern legislatures, and oftentimes in kind of tense wrestling for control with Congress, and who gets to call the shots, who gets to make the laws governing Afro-American freedom. We see the rise of a free African-American economically liberated class of people. We see the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments establishing citizenship, voting rights, outlawing slavery, and so on. Okay, all of that. Throughout all of this, the African-American congregation remains a bulwark of stability, of spiritual expression, and community organizing. At the same time, we see that the community loses a number of its members. Many of them simply abandon the congregation and go join other congregations, the Baptists, the Methodists, and it's the same issue of control that is central to their decision to do so, because the Moravian Church, the way the Moravian Church administration worked through the Southern Province was that this was simply one of a number of congregations. It was served by a white minister. They either couldn't find or were unwilling to cede control to an African-American minister, which meant that in this new life of freedom and self-determination and aspirations for autonomy, that many African-Americans were impatient with white ministers preaching the gospel to them and telling them what they could and couldn't do. All of this is clearly documented in the Moravian records from the post-emancipation years, the 1860s and 70s. You see, in many cases, attendance going down, and the ministers are complaining about this and wondering where everybody is. Well, it really wasn't a secret. The fact that the congregation has survived and endured all this time in spite of that lack of control is a real testament to the survival of and the desire to keep the place going on. At the same time, this enduring theme of African American religious expression and spirituality being a flashpoint for racial conflict was very much an enduring mark of the Reconstruction period. Throughout the South, as African Americans were going to the polls, expressing their demands for citizenship, for greater rights, for greater economic leverage, the backlash from white supremacists took place. Lynchings, of course, but the black church was a particular focal point of white anger and retribution throughout the South. We see many, many instances of African American churches of many denominations being simply burned out and their congregants being driven underground or driven away. We see that time and again. So the church itself becomes this tremendous fulcrum of struggle for control. We see the same thing throughout the 20th century into the civil rights period, when, again, during the African American freedom struggle of the 1950s and 1960s, the black church was again targeted for persecution, for violence. Many of you, of course, have heard of or are familiar with the famous murders of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, in the hot freedom summer of 1964. Less known in that infamous episode is that in the aftermath, and 1 month after that episode, some 35 black churches in Mississippi were burned, victims of arson. This went on throughout the period of the civil rights. So again, to come back to the awful experience of Emmanuel Church in Charleston, very much fits the pattern of persecution of African American religiosity as a symbolic means of expressing a white supremacist attitude and a fear of the black church. So this community then has had a long history with its involvement in matters of racial accord, discord, of acceptance, rejection, of inclusion and exclusion. Let me close by referring to a recent New York Times article, which some of you may have seen, and it refers to the case of Georgetown University, in which Georgetown, of course, was part of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was actually the single largest slave-holding entity anywhere in the Americas. Owned tens of thousands of slaves throughout Latin America. And they owned several hundred slaves in Maryland. And the labor of those slaves helped support the Jesuit College of Georgetown. And in 1838, the college was losing money, it was floundering, wasn't supporting itself. And so the church sold more than 200 of these enslaved people to the Deep South to earn money to keep the college afloat. So Georgetown's existence nowadays owes much to the sale of these human beings. And the New York Times story, there were a couple of stories, traced the journey of these people to the Deep South, largely to Louisiana, another Catholic colony or state. And so it traced this life of uprooting, of rupture, of separatism from being a life in Maryland being sold to the Deep South, this classic case of being sold down the river. And And the journey continued in the sense that the story has traced the descendants of many of these people who were sold to the Deep South, and has raised the question after all these years, okay, your ancestors were sold to keep Georgetown College afloat. Here's this very wealthy, primarily white institution. What's the legacy for the people who were sold and of their descendants? Is there some kind of, what is the reconciliation? Is there a question of reparations? Is there a question of trying to come to grips with that? And of course, the article didn't offer any definitive answers, but it raised the question, what can be done about that? Here's one institution, the Catholic Church, which is grappling with this. We are now in a time in the United States when many institutions are grappling with these kinds of questions. The US government, we see state governments apologizing all the time for slavery. The legislature of Georgia officially apologized, for slavery. You see that in institutions like Brown University, Harvard University, which were founded in the 17th and 18th centuries, largely on the basis of wealth earned through the slave trade in the case of Brown, or in the case of Harvard, of enslaved people who were bought and sold by members of the congregation and college students in Harvard. My own alma mater, the University of Virginia, is going through very much the same kind of soul-searching questioning of what does this mean for us, in the sense that Thomas Jefferson, this principal architect of concept of freedom in our nation, owned close to 200 slaves and never freed any of them, and that at the institution itself, the University of Virginia, there were enslaved people who were living behind the dormitories who would serve the wealthy gentry, sons of the gentry class, and who built many of the buildings. There's a grappling with this going on throughout the country. The Moravian Church has begun that process of grappling. It's begun that process of questioning. It's begun that process of trying to come to grips with the fact that the church owned, promoted slaves, slave holding, and had this long engagement not only with missions, with Christian work, with spreading the gospel to all people, but also of supporting the institution of slavery in the West Indies and here. I believe the church has, this southern province anyway, has formally apologized, if I'm not mistaken, in 2006 for slavery. Yeah, so that process is well underway, but the process never is over. And the process of questioning, of trying to understand the relationship of the past to the present and its meaning to us as a people, as a community, as individuals, never ends. And so the questions continue. What is the relationship of the past to the present, and what can that tell us about who we hope to be in the future? Thank you. Well, I'm happy to take any questions and to try to continue the conversation any way that we can.
My question has to do with the role of education. The Moravians have always been strong on educating their people, boys and girls, and my understanding was that part of the reason for St. Philip's establishment, and I may be incorrect, was the furtherance of education under the guise of religious training for the Black people in the community of Salem at that time.
Well, correct. And indeed it was. And it depends on what you define by education. Yes, they saw this as a principal way to do that. They believed that it was still their Christian duty to teach Christianity to the enslaved population. And so they did have Bible classes. They still, yes, they took this very seriously. And the records are that the Female Mission Society was heavily involved in this. They would hold Bible meetings, study groups with the congregants to because they didn't want them to simply have some superficial understanding of the religion. So yes, they did. They did. And that was, as you say, it was part of the ongoing, lingering tradition of Moravian involvement with education. On the other hand, we could also see that education as an instrument of control, as I suggest, in the sense that this was a version of Christianity that the white Moravians wanted them to have. And there's some indication that some reading and writing lessons took place, but we can be pretty sure that that was pretty heavily monitored and didn't last very long, particularly in the aftermath of Nat Turner, where rules against reading and writing for slaves, which had always been in play to some degree, were very heavily enforced in the aftermath of that. So that was seen because he was a literate preacher, and we can't have that. Yeah, so I take your point about religion. It was very important, and its instruction and the educational mission, very important part of it. Yeah. But again, it was this. It's an arena of struggle for control within the congregation. Yes.
I believe in some cases, before emancipation, the status of slaves changed from slave to free. And I wondered how that happened. Did the slave have some opportunity to practice a trade and get some money, or did the church, of its own free will, free the slave? Can you give any information on that?
Well, that happened, to some extent, I mean, throughout the South, in this community as well as in the broader South, where we do see people who would have had an opportunity to work for themselves outside their regular working hours. They do piecework in the evenings, doing odd jobs, or perhaps they were skilled craftsmen earning money. Yes, they could buy that. And there are several important cases here in this community. Peter Oliver was perhaps the best known case. He was, of course, the enslaved potter in the 18th century who was very skilled. He was an assistant to some of the very skilled Moravian potters. So he was, tremendous contributor to the Moravian pottery tradition. He earned enough money to buy himself free. And there are other important examples as well. There's a very important, a prominent family called the Samuel family. The very first slave that the Moravians bought here in North Carolina was named Johann Samuel in 1769, and he established deep roots within the church. He married, had a number of children, and they were educated in Moravian schools. They learned to read and write and do math, and they played classical instruments. They were members of the African-American congregation in the 1820s, and there are records that they played classical music, like a string quartet, for the church services. The church emancipated their family. So that's a case where the church, just in recognition of Johann Samuel's long service to the church, they simply emancipated his family. There are other cases where so, for example, Emanuel Schober, Gottlieb Schober, Emanuel Schober, Frederick Schumann, and others emancipated up to 20 or 30 slaves in the 1830s for the purpose that they could then go travel to the new colony of Liberia. And so there's a record of an African-American migration from this community to Liberia. I've never been able to trace what happened to them, but it's a powerful testament of that continuity of the desire to go back to Africa. So, in other words, yes, long-winded answer to your question is that there were many vehicles by which people could become free, and there was a substantial free black community in this community on the eve of the Civil War. Yeah, and throughout the South as well. I mean, we're talking several 100,000 people spread out throughout the South. But of course, they too were regarded with suspicion and often not welcomed after they gained their freedom. And many of them had to wear identification badges and patches saying that they were free. And they could be stopped and asked for their papers at any time. So being a free person of color in a slave society was not an easy thing either.
Could you say something about the community of Happy Hills? And that's, used to be right above St. Phillips.
Yeah. Well, I'd probably defer to some members of the audience here who know more about it than I do. What I can say is that the community of Happy Hill is an offshoot of some of the earlier plantations that were established in the early 19th century. The Frederick Schumann plantation was built up there. That marks an interesting transition within the Moravian community away from corporate ownership of slaves to individual ownership of slaves. So in the early days, we see scattered numbers of African Americans incorporated into the Moravian community, and many of them were actually owned by the church. In the early 19th century, individual owners began to acquire plantations and enslaved laborers. One of those was Frederick Schumann, and he set up his plantation in what is now Happy Hill. This was the roots of the Happy Hill community. And as other landowners began acquiring slaves in that area, this became kind of a center of a new African American neighborhood, which then endured into emancipation and became then the genesis of that particular African American neighborhood. But I would actually probably open this question to anyone in the audience who can help us understand the history of Happy Hill or help us understand its relationship to the Moravian community. If anyone can contribute any comments or anything about that, it'd be welcome to hear it. I know that Happy Hill was a number of the members of the Happy Hill community were members of the African American congregation and later of St. Phillips when it became a formal congregation in 1913. So there was a direct connection between that neighborhood and the church, and helped explain its endurance, here well into the 21st century, coming up on this 200th year of existence as a congregation.
To add to your insight, after the war, sale of property to those of African heritage was not condoned. In North Carolina, there were very, very few instances of sales of property, land, to those of African heritage. Here, in Salem, the question was raised to the Salem Congregation Board of Trustees by, members of their church, St. Phillips. And Board of Trustees in 1867, if I remember correctly, the Board of Trustees unanimously decided to sell property in what the former Henry Schumann plantation. He used to sell middle name. Proposed to lay out a community. The vote was unanimous of the Salem Board of Trustees. Then they went home, and the neighbors found out what had transpired. Almost immediately, they held another meeting and unanimously decided not to sell. That was 1867. 5 years later, 6 years later, 1873, if I remember correctly, the Board of Trustees met again and decided that, members of white members of the Moravian Church were buying small building lots in the Happy Hill area, and were immediately selling or turning the deeds over to those of African heritage creating a black community there. Upon learning that or seeing that, the Moravian trustees, the Salem congregation trustees, unanimously decided to drop its ban on selling, lay out a community, call it Liberia, and proceed to sell to those of African heritage. The name Liberia did not stick. It seemed that everybody preferred Happy Hill.
Thank you.
2 weeks ago, the former community of Happy Hill had a reunion, and it was the 200th anniversary of the community that was started in Happy Hill. They had it 2 weeks ago.
Okay, yeah.
So the older people that live on the back streets that belong to Happy Hill.
Wonderful. 200, yeah, that's right.
200
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, yeah.
I was wondering what the view of other provinces might have been about what was going on in the southern province, and did it have any effect? What was the relationship like between the southern province and other provinces?
Well, I mean, the northern province is the closest comparison I can think of, and you know, there was a similar rupture. I won't say complete rupture, but there was similar tensions within the Moravian Church, northern and southern, as happened with the Methodists and Baptists and others who had, in fact, you know, the Methodists and Baptists in particular, had a complete break with their southern brethren from the north. In the Moravian Church, northern province, by the 1830s and 40s and 50s, they were becoming very uncomfortable with the slave-owning practices of their southern brethren, and there are records that show that they protested and tried to call account to their southern slave-owning brethren. So that there was not a complete rupture within the church, but there was obviously tension, and the northern Moravians, went off to fight for the Union, and the southern Moravians went to fight for the Confederacy. So there was that tension. A larger issue would also be, what about the Moravian Church central administration in Herrnhut in Germany? Bear in mind that the Moravian Church central administration never denounced slaveholding. There were pockets of abolitionist sentiment within the Moravian Church in the northern province and in England and in the Netherlands, which became increasingly uncomfortable with the intertwining of the church with slavery. But the church central administration never denounced it. They just kind of left it up for individual congregations and provinces to decide. So that the Moravian Church owned plantations in the West Indies, in Jamaica, in St. Croix, St. Thomas, St. John, and of course here. But it never caused the kind of sort of cathartic, existential hand-wringing that it produced in other churches that we saw in, say, with the Methodist or, again, the Baptist example.
In your studies, did you ever run across the second African graveyard on the corner of Cemetery Street and Salem Avenue? And could you fill me in on those 170 or 80 folks that are buried there and then forgotten?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the site that you're referring to, and it has become recently a focus of study for Old Salem and I suppose for the Moravian Church as well. Many of those graves that are still visible are from the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, I think, so that there's a kind of, once the graveyard filled up in front of St. Phillips, then it it's shifted over to that other site. I'm not familiar enough with the names of the people who are buried there or the history of where they may have worked or lived or their participation in the church to be able to answer with any precision, who they were. Undoubtedly, more research is going to reveal all that because, again, one of the glories of the Moravian records is that the precision of the record keeping was quite good. And so I have no doubt that their lives can be retraced and given more visibility, as you say, because it's tucked away, it's sort of out of the public eye, and yet it deserves to be resurrected and have the history brought more to the fore than we currently know. What I can say is that there are a number of people looking into it, people associated with Old Salem who are going to turn their attention to that very soon. That's my sense from talking to staff members there. Yeah, so thank you for that question because it is a very important part of the community. I think we'll learn more about it in the coming years.
Can you talk about the music connection between the African community and the white Moravian community? Did the white Moravian community teach European traditions, and did the whites learn from the African traditions? Did they write any of it down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Music, as we know, was this arena of social and cultural interchange among black and white Southerners of all kinds throughout, across centuries, of course. We see some of that here in this community. Some of it involved, as you say, the teaching of European traditions to people of African descent, and we see that in the early education that the singing of Moravian hymns, that black Moravians learned to sing Moravian hymns and to play European classical instruments, violin and so on. And again, to refer to that incident in the church where there's a string quartet, and this is very much a part of a kind of a reverberation from the early years when black and white brethren sat in church together and worshiped together and so on. So there is that tradition. At the same time, we have to remember that many of the enslaved people came from other traditions and had other musical traditions as well. So for example, there was one African-born man in Bethabara. He served in the tavern in Bethabara, and in the years before he was baptized and joined the Moravian Church, the records tell us that he would dance on the street corner in Bethabara, out in the public square there, to earn some money, earn some spare change. And so we can imagine that he would have danced in an African style of dancing, okay, which would, of course, have been accompanied with music and his own traditional culture. Don't know if he sang or what exactly it entailed. But then after he was baptized, he gave all that up. So he seems to have had a kind of conscious turning away from his African tradition to embrace Moravian traditions. And in that sense, I'm not suggesting that he forgot that he was African or where he came from or anything like that, but it involves a kind of calculus of decision-making about, if I'm going to join the Moravian Church, they don't want me to dance in an African style, so I'm not going to do that. I don't have any direct evidence of white people adopting African forms or African-American forms of musical expression here in this community. Of course, we know that it happened across the South elsewhere, but I haven't seen any evidence of how that might have played out, how that musical interchange might have played out here. And it's a fascinating thing to speculate about, because you can think that, well, yeah, look, I mean, not all these people were sitting in Love Feast all the time. I mean, they were doing other kinds of things, worshiping in other ways, singing other kinds of songs, expressing themselves in ways that were not always observed by or sanctioned by white Moravians. And so therefore, we have to assume that some of those traditions lingered on and were being expressed elsewhere. The strength and the weakness of the Moravian records upon which we draw for this research is that Moravian ministers were interested in reporting things from their perspective, which is that how do these manifestations of behavior conform to our expectations of Christian comportment? So they're looking at things from their own religious standpoint. That's the strength. The weakness is that they often didn't write about, or they didn't see, or they didn't care to write about other things that didn't conform to that version of spirituality. And so, therefore, we don't have many descriptions of African American musical styles. We don't have many descriptions of things that didn't conform to Moravian notions of propriety. And so that's one of the big gaps in the records. But actually, now that I think about it, there was a description of a burial in Bethania in the 1830s, written by minister George Bonson. And he described the burial of an African American, not even necessarily a church member, but some member of the slave community out there. And he described this long procession out to the graveyard near Bethania. And I've been out there, my wife Beverly and I went out there years ago to try to find it, and we never could. The description was not quite precise enough. But anyway, the description in Bonson's diary is that there was this long train procession of people mourning and singing and clapping and musical expression that way. So and they got up to the gravesite and did the burial service and so on. So that to me is evidence that in the countryside outside of the periphery of town, you probably would have found much more of that kind of expression of African American musicality and ritual that had nothing to do with the Moravian way of doing things.
I heard you at lunch today and this evening, and you were describing the particularly those enslaved that became members of the church as spiritual brothers and sisters. There were enslaved that did not join the church. But in general, how did the slave holders, which included the church, treat the people? Because we hear the stories of so much ways in which people have masters treated slaves. Can you tell from the records, was there that continued respect in their daily lives and as they worked for and with the enslaved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it gets at the heart of this contradiction I've been talking about tonight. What is the balance between slave ownership, claiming to own another person's body, and yet to insist at the same time that their soul is free? And the day-to-day treatment of enslaved people is an important way in which this contradiction played out. We see that oftentimes we can mark a clear point of division between the point before which the enslaved people were baptized and after which they were baptized. Baptism in the Moravian Church meant everything. It meant you were part of this fellowship. It meant you were accepted, you were incorporated, you were a brother or a sister in Christ. If you were not that, you were an outsider. You were considered simply not part of the community. And if you were enslaved and outside of that, then that was even worse. So we find records then of enslaved people who were not yet part of the Moravian community, who disobeyed, who did things that the community disapproved of. They ran away, for example, tried to escape, and were brought back and severely punished. There were beatings, the whippings, and there are records of these things occurring within the church. So, yeah, enslaved people were whipped and beaten here as throughout the South. After baptism, that meant they were incorporated. That meant they were part of this fellowship. And I find very few instances of corporal punishment of enslaved people after that baptismal demarcation line. And so, that's not to say they didn't do things that aroused the ire of the community elders. In fact, they did things all the time that antagonize the elders. There was one instance in which, all right, here's a really good instance, okay. The enslaved woman, Anna, sometimes called Nancy, in 1811, she was working for the tavern keeper in Bethabara, and they were having tense relationships, arguments. And so in disgust, she just simply left her position and walked all the way to Salem to complain. Said, this guy is mistreating me. I don't like it. I don't know if that meant that he was beating her or whatever it meant. But she went to complain to the Board of Elders, and they intervened on her behalf. And they reprimanded him. And they said, okay, now we hope you feel comfortable going back and resuming your position, or we want you to get along amicably with this guy. Okay. The same thing happened a couple years later, so they were still trying to work it out. But the point is that she understood that the disciplinary structure of the church could be used to her advantage, that she had somebody she could appeal to, and that was the Board of Elders. They were the ultimate masters, and so they intervened and helped to protect her. So we could say that in general, enslaved people who were members of the community had levers of support and protection that they might not have had elsewhere throughout, in fact, didn't have elsewhere throughout the slave South. This was one very distinctive and peculiar aspect of this community. I would also say that there's a second demarcation point, which is that after the diminishing of the church's direct involvement in slave ownership by the 1820s, they held very few slaves. Individuals owned slaves at that point. That marked another demarcation point where the church didn't intervene anymore, and that left enslaved people more vulnerable to mistreatment, individually administered punishment, and in the 1830s, there's a record where they held a love feast at the African-American congregation to say farewell to several members of the congregation who were being sold to Alabama. All right, so these were enslaved people who were owned by Moravian owners who were sold to the Deep South, very much in this case that I mentioned here with the Georgetown University. In earlier years, one of the key aspects was that if you join the church and you give your allegiance and your obedience to the church, we will protect you. We will not sell you. We will not sell any of your family members. We will maintain the integrity of your marriage. That's our quid pro quo. You give us your faith, you give us your religion, you give us your bonded obedience. We will protect you. We will treat you as well as we can without selling your family members. By the 1830s, that contractual agreement, as it were, is simply broken. And you never would have seen people being sold to the Deep South in the 1780s or 90s, and yet it was happening by the 1830s, indicating to me that white Moravians were becoming pretty much like other white Southerners, and their willingness to buy and sell people of color as they chose. And that, to me, is a kind of again, a part of this tragic diminution of this what had been a powerful statement about the possibilities of religion to regulate relationships between masters and slaves.
Yeah, John, I just want to jump back. This question that Wesley brought up about liturgy and hymns is just fascinating to me, and kind of took me back to how you started with the Mother Emanuel example. The community I'm also part of took some time to look back at the service of Reverend Pinckney that took place right after that event, and the eulogy that President Obama offered, where he says he was a pastor, and then he also became Reverend Pinckney became a public servant as a senator. And he said, some people said, why would you want to do that? You're already a pastor, why would you want to go and do this other thing too? And the president said, such people probably don't understand the history of AME church and the connection between those things. It makes me think about that today when we're celebrating Brother Cedric Rodney and his work, both in the congregation and in the public arena too. And in that way, it seems like Cedric Rodney is a good representation of things that the Moravian Church has learned about being in both spheres, something it probably learned from its African-American members through various points in time. So my question is, are there moments when we develop an understanding of a Black and Moravian philosophy, theology? And I know you said we get most of our history from Eurocentric eyes, but we also got these stories of like Anthony Ulrich, whose kind of adjustment in how the mission went into St. Thomas suggests a difference of opinion that came from his experience in his Blackness. And do we have any other persons that can help us understand that pre-20th century, what it meant to be Black and Moravian? And I say that also in light of the fact that you're going to be looking, or you are working on tens of thousands of pages of stuff from the West Indies, I think, from the 18th and 19th century. So I'm wondering whether there's even developing communication on what it meant to be Black and Moravian at that time.
That's a really good question. Let me give you two examples, both from the West Indies. One of them is from the 1730s, from the St. Thomas Mission, where, as you know, this was the first site of the Moravian evangelical work, and where they had their first great success, and they attracted a congregation of hundreds of people. Okay, so this is really, we could say this is the very first African-American Protestant congregation in the world, essentially, in St. Thomas, now known as New Herrenhoop Moravian Church. One of the missionaries there recorded a conversation he had with a Black church member, an enslaved member, and he said that I talked to this woman, and she said that she was walking down the road, and she met up with one of the slave masters, and the master said, "What are you doing out here walking around?" And she said, "Well, I've joined this Christian congregation, and I know that I'm going to heaven, and you're not." And so this gave a sense that she interpreted the Moravian religion as a means of turning power on its head, that rather than denying Christianity because you're a slave, rather I accept Christianity because I'm a better Christian than you are. I'm not defiling Christ's word as you are through your slave holding. And this became a common trope throughout African-American Christian congregations, whether in the West Indies or in the American South, the sense that there was a sense of chosenness, of preference, that Jesus died for them, not for the slave owners, died to redeem the enslaved, the damned, the dispossessed. The African-American theologian Howard Thurman has written very eloquently about this in his book, Jesus and the Dispossessed, that Jesus had the sense that he was the suffering servant whose death would redeem all this horribleness. I think we see a great deal of corroboration of that viewpoint here within the Moravian community, both here as well as in the West Indies. Now, the flip side of that, a second example, is one that I came across very recently from the British colony of Antigua in the West Indies, where the Moravians had a thriving community, and they had lots of people that they believed were converts, but they were constantly disciplining them. You look at the disciplinary records that were kept very carefully by the Moravian missionaries in Antigua, and they're constantly disciplining people. You know, Sister so-and-so, we had to banish her for 3 weeks because she consulted a conjurer. And Sister so-and-so else consulted a conjurer to make her husband come back to her. and brother so-and-so, and this is an amazing example, brother so-and-so chopped off his fingers, and so we disciplined him. And we can imagine that brother, whatever his name was, chopped off his own. Self-mutilation as a form of slave resistance by taking away a valued worker from the sugar fields. Wow. So, and he was disciplined because he defiled his own body, but in the process he also became a rebellious slave. And then one example in this disciplinary court book that I found is that an enslaved woman named Martha was disciplined. She was banished from the church because it said she dropped her dress and displayed her nakedness to the missionaries and claimed that she would have no sickness like faith. I'm still working through that one, but we can so here she's using her own body as kind of weaponizing her body as a form of scorn for the Moravian religion. I'm just going to drop it all and display myself, and this is what I think of you and your religion. Okay, so these two poles, this polarity of accepting Christianity, seeing Christianity as a powerful weapon of resistance, of spiritual sustenance, that Christ died for me, not for you, is one part of that. And many people came to accept that. The other part is that your Christian religion, with all its rules and regulations and its pro-slavery message, is a crock, and I don't want anything to do with it. So this was the world in which these people operated, and everybody had to come to their own decision, of course, and very difficult to say, well, either you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, but there are many layers of believership among that. Yeah, I kind of believe certain things about Christianity and not in others, but I can also endorse methods of African spirituality, seeing obia practitioners, conjure men, using African methods of worship with worship beads or amulets and things like that. Common in West African cultures, those things didn't disappear in the West Indies, and they didn't disappear here either. So we could speculate that there's a great deal of overlap, of a layering of multiple strata of religious practice going on. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question of what does it mean to be black and Moravian. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's a great question, and thank you for answering it. But it's there's no simple answer. There's a lot of different answers.
Yeah, I really had a couple of questions before. I was wondering if there was
wondering if there was a correlation in history and time between when Moravian women, for a time at least, were less valued and allowed to have positions of leadership, if it was at that same time that we began to value and treat with less respect our brothers and sisters of color that we were enslaving, perchance, if that was the same time frame. And then my other question, it's a good time to ask this, is what now? I mean, I hear that when we invite anyone new into our congregation, we should welcome the diverse things they bring and make that maybe part of what we are. But what else? I mean, I am part of a congregation that, best as I can figure, maybe 2 people of color have joined our church in 50 years or more. So I wonder if is it restoration that we become more diverse, or is it safety that we stay more close to those more like us in the way they look or act or sing?
That's a powerful, because your question reverberates not only through the Moravian Church but other Christian churches and through? I mean, isn't that the question that we're wrestling with as a nation now? We see so much in our era of President Obama and the promises of a so-called post-racial society, which I never took seriously anyway. And now we see on the eve of his departure from the White House the limitations of that promise. It is both discouraging and encouraging that we're having the kinds of conversations we are nowadays as a country, because we see every day new expressions of racism by public figures and others. So that's, it hasn't gone away. But we are also seeing new attempts to grapple with the legacy of race in the kinds of discussions that I mentioned earlier about reparations, or about facing up, institutions facing up to their own racist past. Let's put it like that. And yeah, what's the way of overcoming that? I mean, there's no simple way. It's a matter of individual conversations and institutional conversations, and trying to me, I mean, that's why I'm a historian. That's why I'm doing this, is that I feel that there can be no honest conversation without an understanding of the history. So that's what I've tried to do, is just to do my part to uncover the history, but that's only a beginning. That's not an end. That alone is not going to get us where we need to be in terms of reconciliation and having honest conversations. So to your question is what does that mean for the Moravian Church now? I can't answer that. That's the question that has to happen within the Moravian Church. And can anyone help us out here to help further this conversation about what's the meaning of this stuff now?
I think, yeah, the women in Salem were kicked out of church council about a year before. Their expulsion from power in the church was consecutive with the expulsion of African Americans from the church. And the creation of the Women's Society, Mission Society, was also part of that reaction to their losing their power in the church. So they created a parallel ministry structure where they could have agency and ministry that was separate from the organization of the congregation. So I can answer that. I can't answer the other question.
Does anyone else care to contribute any insight?
Well, just one of the things, I'm at Bethania Moravian, Russ was there as well. Bethania has an interesting history with Bethania AME Zion Church, and it was very interesting. This past year, the host church for our Thanksgiving service was Bethania AME Zion, and United Baptists and Bethania Moravian AME Zion worshiped together. One of the few times where I was really felt blessed to be a part of something much bigger, church-wise, than just me as a Moravian pastor, and it was a wonderful experience. And the offering we took up that night was for the mother, Emmanuel, because we really felt connected to that, and we said we were at AME Zion. We really didn't feel like the money should go to any one of our particular churches. We felt like it should go to AME Zion and be used there, and it was contributed down to AME Zion and that church, because we really felt connected to that. And I would say for us in Bethania, and the area that I grew up around Bethania, that's an ongoing discussion. And it has a lot of reverberations. The incorporation of Bethania as a village again, what was part of the Freedmen's community on Highway 65, was it included in Bethania, was it not? All those questions were raised again. And so those questions continue to reverberate into our current culture, and I would like to say there's always great positive outcomes on that, but I would have to say that's probably not true. So I hope we can do more work with that as contemporary Moravians, and also look to our AME Zion neighbors because it's a great deal of history. Because if you look at the AME Zion churches in Davie County and Forsyth County, and moving to Davie County, the same names of the people that were members of Afro-Moravian Church that were black, slave, and free are also the same names that are buried in the graveyards of the AME Zion churches there. Smithtown, AME Zion, Harmony Grove has the same names, and AME Zion Church has the same last names as the people at Bethania. So there's a connection that we have not fully embraced, I would say, as Moravians, or have even been aware of. For most people, people don't even know that history there, that we have neighbors and cousins and family members that are just buried in the graveyard on the other side of the hill of Bethania Moravian Church's God's Acre. So.
Oh, yeah, I would say that that's when we're looking for threads of empathy and continuity, of discussion, of potential reconciliation, to try to transcend all the differences, the divisions, the violence, the harshness of the last 300 years, that the church is one such vehicle where that can happen. Because if anything, as I said, that if the history of Christianity, is one that aspires to produce a culture of inclusion, and obviously it has not always done so, that there is at least the possibility that it can inspire attempts to rekindle that. As the famous saying goes, the most segregated hour of worship is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, or the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock Sunday morning. But if anything, the lesson of the Moravians shows that was not always the case, that didn't come until many years later. And the early history of the Moravian community here shows that it was a moment of togetherness, a moment of spiritual fellowship, not division. So perhaps that is a lesson that from history that we can try to work through and see if it has meaning for us today. Okay, well, I guess that'll do it then. All right. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.